How do you do? I'm Dr. John Sace, an economist. In this video, we will consider the various factors that cause supply and demand to shift and determine the effects that these changes have on equilibrium, price, and quantity. Specifically, we will address the following. 1. We will identify the factors that cause demand to shift, and we will determine the effects of those changes upon equilibrium, price, and quantity. 2. We will identify the factors that cause supply to shift and determine the effects of those changes upon equilibrium. 3. We will consider what happens when supply and demand both shift concurrently, depending on the directions of change, an increase or decrease, and the magnitudes of these changes. We will determine the outcome in terms of equilibrium, price, and quantity. We explore the 16 distinct possibilities for shifts in normal supply and demand. Of these possibilities, there are 4 in which only supply or only demand experiences a shift. In the other 12, we consider the cases in which supply and demand both shift concurrently. Let's begin with supply. First, let us identify the major factors that cause supply to change. Depending on whether the factor increases or decreases, we will have certain expectations about the movement of supply. Will supply increase or will it decrease? These variables have a directional effect on supply. For instance, if the number of sellers increases, we may expect the supply of a product to increase as well. For example, if each of 10 vendors, the suppliers, brings 10 bushels of apples to the marketplace, there will be a potential supply of 100 bushels. However, if 2 additional vendors each arrive with the same number of bushels, then there will be 120 bushels of apples ready to sell to able and willing customers in the market. The other supply changing variables that we consider in this video are ones that affect cost and production in some manner. The cost of producing and bringing a product to market may involve many separate costs. These costs include expenditures on wages to employees, taxes paid to the government, and losses due to scrap, the amount of product not suitable for sale. Also, costs may include items such as an investment in improved technology. Now, most of us would consider an improvement to be one that lowers costs rather than raising them. The simple approach is for us to ask, if not for a change in the number of sellers, how will a specific variable affect cost? By answering this question, we will understand in which direction supply will shift. Put simply, any variable that reduces cost will lead to an increase in supply such that the supply curve shifts downward and to the right. In the first 2 graphs, we consider 2 market examples in which only supply shifts and determines specific changes to equilibrium, price, and quantity. In the first of these 2 supply shift examples, we look at an increase in supply that we graph as a shift downward and to the right. An increase in sellers could be drawn as a pure shift to the right, while a decrease in cost could result in a vertical shift downward. Therefore, we consider an example in which more producers enter the market as the cost of raw material is falling. The result is a decrease in equilibrium price accompanied by an increase in equilibrium quantity. In the second of our supply shift examples, we consider a decrease in supply that we graph as a shift upward and to the left. A decrease in the number of sellers could be drawn as a pure shift to the left, while any increase in cost would result in a vertical shift upward. This is because we can consider the supply curve to be a cost curve, specifically marginal cost. Therefore, we can work through an example in which producers leave the market while wages, the cost of labor, are rising. The result is an increase in equilibrium price accompanied by a decrease in equilibrium quantity. Next, we look at demand. First, we identify major factors that cause demand to shift. Depending on whether the factor increases or decreases, we have certain expectations about the movement of demand. Will demand increase or will it decrease? Most demand-changing variables that we consider are ones that shift demand in the same direction as an increase in the number of buyers. Our most common determinants include changes in income, tastes and preferences, prices of competing goods, substitutes, and prices of normal accompanying goods, complements. Of these four factors, income usually is the key factor because it reflects both the ability and relative willingness of a buyer to purchase a product. For many goods, especially luxury goods, buyers will purchase a greater quantity or a superior quality of a product if their disposable incomes rise. For example, as income increases, a person may attend more concerts or sporting events because they are willing and more able to do so. Therefore, as income rises, demand for these normal goods increases. Changing tastes and preferences also affect demand. For example, if a particular style or color of apparel or model of automobile becomes more popular, this translates into an increase in demand due to increasing taste and preference for the product. And here we assume that income and other determinants of demand remain constant. In addition, the prices of closely related products affect the demand of the product that we are interested in purchasing. For example, we are indifferent between having one of two popular sports drinks that each cost $1 in a vending machine. If one of them is not available, we indifferently substitute the other brand for it. However, if the price of one rises to $1.50 while the other remains at $1, we are more likely to purchase the lower price brand. Therefore, if the price of a substitute brand increases, we tend to purchase the alternative. Similarly, if the price decreases for some other good which we normally combine as a complementary product, we may decide to purchase more of both products without going beyond a given budget. For example, a daycare that serves children a variety of sandwiches for lunch may decide to serve peanut butter and jelly sandwiches more frequently if the price of peanut butter decreases. We assume that all other prices remain constant. If the daycare purchases more peanut butter at the reduced price, it can purchase more jelly, even though the price of jelly has remained constant. Therefore, we can say that peanut butter and jelly complement one another and that the decrease in the price of one affects the demand for the other. If the price of the complement, the peanut butter, decreases, the demand for the own good, the jelly, increases. These variable factors have a directional effect on demand. For instance, if the number of buyers increases, we may expect the demand of a product to increase as well. For example, if each of 100 buyers, the demanders, stop at a newsstand and buy one copy of the Wall Street Journal, a total of 100 copies are demanded. However, if 10 additional buyers stop and buy the journal, then 110 copies would be purchased by the newsstand customers. In the following two examples, we explore two market examples in which only demand shifts and determines specific changes to equilibrium price and quantity. In the first of these demand shift examples, we consider an increase in demand that we graph as a shift upward and to the right. An increase in the number of buyers could be drawn as a pure shift to the right, while an increase in taste, income, or the price of a substitute good would result in a shift upward and to the right, as they reflect both quantitative and qualitative differences of the product. Therefore, we consider an example in which more buyers enter the market while their incomes rise. The result is an increase in both the equilibrium price and quantity. In the second of these examples, we will look at a decrease in demand that we graph as a shift downward and to the left. A decrease in the number of buyers could be drawn as a pure shift to the left, while a decrease in income would result in a vertical shift downward. Therefore, we consider an example in which buyers leave the market while incomes are falling. The result is a decrease in equilibrium price accompanied by a decrease in equilibrium quantity. What happens to equilibrium when both supply and demand shift concurrently? The first thing that we need to remember is that increases in most of the supply factors, the cost factors, leads to a decrease in supply, a shift upward and to the left. However, increases in most of the demand factors leads to an increase in demand, a shift upward and to the right. Another fact that we need to remember is that equilibrium quantity moves in the same direction as both supply and demand. If either increases, the equilibrium quantity will increase. However, equilibrium price moves contrastingly. As with quantity, the equilibrium price moves in the same direction as the demand shift. An increase in demand leads to an increase in price. The exception in price movement comes with supply. If supply increases, the equilibrium price tends to decrease. In effect, equilibrium price moves opposite of the shift in supply. In the first set of three graphs, we consider market examples in which both supply and demand increase. However, the relative magnitudes of the shifts determine the specific changes to equilibrium price and quantity. In the first example, we find a medium increase of equal magnitude for both supply and demand. As with our preceding example, more producers enter the market while the cost of raw material declines. This causes an increase in supply downward and to the right. From this, we expect a decrease in equilibrium price, though an increase in quantity. Meanwhile, an increase in the number of buyers and an increase in consumer tastes and income result in a demand shift upward and to the right. As with supply, we expect an increased quantity. However, the demand increase pulls equilibrium price upward by an amount that exactly offsets the downward supply effect on price. The final result is an increase in equilibrium quantity while equilibrium price remains constant. In the second example, we consider a large increase in supply along with a small increase in demand. As in our previous example, more producers are entering the market while the cost of raw material is falling. This time, it causes a large increase in supply, downward and to the right. We expect a larger decrease in equilibrium price along with a large increase in quantity. Meanwhile, an increase in the number of buyers and the price of a substitute good produces a small shift in demand upward and to the right. As with supply, we expect an increased quantity. However, the demand increase pulls the equilibrium price upward by a smaller amount than the downward price effect caused by the large supply increase. Again, the result is an increase in equilibrium quantity, though in this example the equilibrium price decreases. Again, in our third example, both supply and demand increase. Here we consider a small increase in supply offset by a large increase in demand. More producers are entering the market while the cost of raw material is falling. This time, it causes a small shift in supply downward and to the right. We expect a smaller decrease in equilibrium price accompanied by a small increase in quantity. Concurrently, an increase in the number of buyers and their tastes and income result in a large demand shift upward and to the right. As with supply, we expect an increase in equilibrium quantity. However, the demand increase pulls the equilibrium price upward by a greater amount than the small supply increase has on the downward effect on price. The final result is an increase in equilibrium quantity, though the net effect of supply and demand shift renders a higher equilibrium price. In the second set of three examples, we consider what happens when both supply and demand decrease. Again, the relative magnitudes of the shifts determine the specific change to equilibrium price and quantity. For the first of these three examples, we see medium decreases of equal magnitude for both supply and demand. Some producers leave the market while the cost of raw material rises. This scenario causes a decrease in supply, upward and to the left. As with all normal supply curves, we expect an increase in equilibrium price along with a decrease in equilibrium quantity. Meanwhile, a decrease in the number of buyers and a decrease in taste, income, or the price of a substitute good results in a decrease in demand, shifting downward and to the left. As with supply, we expect a decrease in equilibrium quantity. However, the demand decrease pulls the equilibrium price downward by an amount that offsets the upward effect on price caused by the decreasing supply. The net result is a decrease in equilibrium quantity accompanied by an equilibrium price that remains constant. In our second example, we consider a large decrease in supply along with a small decrease in demand. Continuing our illustrative example, some producers leave the market while the cost of raw material increases. This causes a large decrease in supply, upward and to the left. We expect a larger increase in equilibrium price accompanied by a large decrease in quantity. Simultaneously, a decrease in the number of buyers along with a decrease in income results in a small shift downward and to the left. As with supply, we expect a decrease in quantity. However, the demand decrease pulls equilibrium price downward by a smaller magnitude than the large increasing price effect caused by the supply decrease. Again, the result is a decrease in equilibrium quantity. However, equilibrium price experiences a net increase. In our third example, both supply and demand decrease again. This time, we consider a small decrease in supply against a large decrease in demand. Again, some producers are leaving the market while the cost of raw material rises a bit, causing a small decrease in supply, upward and to the left. Due to the supply shift, we expect a small increase in price accompanied by a small decrease in quantity. Concurrently, a large decrease in the number of buyers along with a decrease in taste, income, and the price of a substitute good results in a large demand decrease, shifting downward to the left. We expect a net increase in equilibrium quantity. However, the demand decrease pulls the equilibrium price downward by a greater magnitude than the upward effect on price caused by a small supply decrease. The result is a decrease in equilibrium quantity along with a decrease in equilibrium price. Throughout this third set of graphs, we examined the effects of a supply increase against a demand decrease. The relative magnitudes of the shift will determine the net changes to equilibrium, price, and quantity. In the first example, we consider medium shifts of equal magnitude. However, this time supply increases while demand decreases. More producers enter the market as the cost of raw material is falling. This causes an increase in supply, downward and to the right. From our earlier discussion, we expect a decrease in equilibrium price along with an increasing quantity from this supply increase. Meanwhile, a decrease in the number of buyers along with a decrease in taste, income, and the price of a substitute good results in a decreasing demand that shifts downward and to the left. The decrease in demand decreases the equilibrium quantity by the same amount that the supply increase raises the quantity. Hence, the supply and demand shifts cancel one another out in respect to quantity. However, the demand decrease and the supply increase pull and push the equilibrium price downward. The net result is no change in equilibrium quantity, though equilibrium price falls due to both the supply and demand shifts. In the second example, we consider a large increase in supply against a small decrease in demand. As before, more producers enter the market while the cost of raw material falls. This time, the magnitude of the changes causes a large shift in supply downward and to the right. We expect a larger decrease in price along with a large increase in quantity. Meanwhile, a small decrease in the number of buyers and a decrease in the price of substitute goods results in a small shift downward and to the left. As in the preceding example, we expect a decrease in quantity. Supply and demand price effects compound one another downward. However, the small demand decrease causes the equilibrium quantity to decrease, while the large supply increase has a larger and opposite effect. The net result is a small increase in equilibrium quantity, while equilibrium price falls due to the joint effect of supply and demand on price. In the third example, in which supply increases and demand decreases, we consider a small increase in supply against a large decrease in demand. Some producers are entering the market while the cost of raw material is falling. This leads to a small increase in supply downward and to the right. Therefore, we expect a small decrease in price accompanied by a small increase in quantity. Concurrently, a decrease in the number of buyers and a decrease in taste, income, and the price of substitute goods results in a large decreasing demand shift downward and to the left. The supply and demand price changes compound one another downward. However, the large decrease in demand decreases the equilibrium quantity by a large amount, while the small increase in supply pushes equilibrium quantity a distance in the opposite direction. The result is a small decrease in equilibrium quantity, while equilibrium price falls due to both the supply and demand price effects. In our final set of three graphs, we explore what happens when supply decreases while demand increases. As with all the preceding examples, the relative magnitudes of the shifts will determine the net changes to equilibrium price and quantity. In the first example, we consider a medium decrease in supply accompanied by a medium increase in demand. Now, producers exit the market as the cost of raw material rises. This causes a decrease in supply, shifting the curve upward and to the left. Because of this action, we expect an increase in equilibrium price, but a decrease in equilibrium quantity. Simultaneously, an increase in the number of buyers and an increase in taste, income, and the price of a substitute good results in a demand shift upward and to the right. The increase in demand increases the equilibrium quantity by the same amount that the decrease in supply decreases the equilibrium quantity. Hence, the supply and demand shifts cancel one another out. However, the demand increase pulls the equilibrium price upward while the supply decrease does the same. The net result is one of no change in equilibrium quantity, though equilibrium price increases due to both the supply and the demand effects on price. In the second example, we consider a large decrease in supply against a small increase in demand. As before, producers are leaving the market as the cost of raw material rises. This time, these events cause a large decrease in supply, shifting upward and to the left. We expect a larger increase in price along with a large decrease in quantity. Meanwhile, a small increase in the number of buyers and an increase in tastes and income results in a small shift upward and to the right. As in the preceding example, we expect an increase in quantity. The supply and demand price effects compound one another upward. However, the small demand increase pulls the equilibrium quantity to the right, while the large decrease in supply moves quantity in the opposite direction. The net result is a small decrease in the equilibrium quantity, while the equilibrium price rises due to both the supply and the demand effect on price. In the third and final example, in which supply decreases and demand increases, we consider a small decrease in supply against a large increase in demand. Some producers exit the market while the cost of raw material rises. These events cause a small decrease in supply, upward and to the left. Therefore, we expect a small increase in price accompanied by a small decrease in quantity. Concurrently, an increase in the number of buyers and an increase in taste, income, and the price of substitute goods results in a large demand shift upward and to the right. The supply and demand pressures on price compound one another upward. However, the large increase in demand pulls the equilibrium quantity to the right, while the small decrease in supply pushes equilibrium quantity in the opposite direction by a smaller magnitude. Net result is a small increase in equilibrium quantity, while equilibrium price rises due to the compounding effect of the supply and demand shifts. In this video, we have explored the changes in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity due to shifts in supply and demand. We have identified the factors that cause demand to change, along with the factors that cause supply to change. With the basics in mind, we have learned what happens to equilibrium price and quantity when supply and demand change separately, as well as what happens to equilibrium when supply and demand change simultaneously. We hope that you have benefited from this presentation. If you did, please like, subscribe, and share a comment about what other topics would be worthwhile to you. Thank you and have a wonderful day.